They were told that capture meant dishonor and death. They were told that the enemy would strip them of dignity. But when the train doors slid open in the biting Wisconsin cold, what waited for them was something none of their training, none of their terror, had prepared them for: the smell of grilled meat and the clink of glass bottles packed in ice. Snow crusted along the tracks, the air cut like a blade. They stepped down cautiously. Thin gloves, patched uniforms, eyes narrowed against the pale light dusting the yard. The guard detail did not bark. No kicks, no swinging rifle butts. The men were counted briskly, then guided forward. Boots crunched. Breath hovered like ghosts. It wasn't silence that unsettled them. It was normalcy. Normalcy, in a place they had been taught to imagine as a realm of monsters. On the far side of the yard, smoke drifted up from a low building. A scent slipped through the frost, rich and alien. Fat sizzling, bread warming, something sweet and tangy. Hunger stirred, wary but stubborn. They had been hungry for months. Many would not admit it. Inside the mess hall, heat hit them in a wave. The floor was scrubbed wood. Long tables, dented metal trays, an American flag on the wall, familiar only from pamphlets warning them of Western decay, not from any personal encounter. They did not look at it long. Their eyes were pulled to the line moving toward the serving station. There, under bright lights, were steaks of meat layered in buns, hamburgers, the cooks called them, and beside them, crates lined with glass bottles capped in red. A soldier popped one cap with a twist, and the room seemed to hiss. The sweet, caramelly smell wrapped itself around the room like an invitation and an accusation. They wore armbands marked with numerals and letters. They had their names still, in their heads, in their bones, even if the papers wrote them in unfamiliar letters. They had been soldiers, sailors, gunners, signalmen. They had been told that death was cleaner than capture. And yet here they were, fingers numb and shoulders tight, being told to take one tray each, keep the line moving, don't drop the cutlery. Some obeyed mechanically, others hesitated, scanning for the hidden cruelty. Why feed an enemy? Why waste meat on men you'd been trained to kill? Why make kindness feel like a trap? The camp cook, a round-faced man with sleeves rolled to the elbow, leaned over the counter and spoke to no one in particular. "Take two if you want. We've got plenty." His accent had the long vowels of the upper Midwest, a music that made the room feel softer than it looked. They took one. Most of them took one. Then they found their places. A young man at the second table stared at the hamburger like it might move on its own. He had eaten fish from the harbor as a boy, rice portioned carefully during training, hard biscuits on transport ships. He had never seen meat pressed like this, never smelled it mingled with something tart, bright, almost playful. He picked up the top bun. Under it was a slice of tomato, a leaf of crisp lettuce, a smear of yellow mustard, a line of red sauce. Ketchup, he would later learn to call it. He put the bun back and lifted the bottle set beside his tray. The glass was cold enough to bite his fingertips. He watched the bubbles climb to the top and burst in tiny, fizzing rings. Around him, trays rattled. A few men waited, eyes on the guards. But the guards were talking among themselves about the weather, the long drive in, the frozen river. The POWs were not centered in their fear. The fear sat inside their throats, demanding obedience even when no command was given. Somewhere, beyond winter, beyond this hall, shells fell across islands and cities. But here, the most dangerous thing was the sound of a bottle cap hitting a metal tray with a tap. He raised the burger. He took one bite. Heat bloomed. Salt and fat and the bright edge of mustard. He felt the bread compress and spring back. There was a faint sweetness in the sauce, a tang that made his jaw spark. He swallowed and reached, almost involuntarily, for the drink. The first sip shocked him, cold like river stones, fizz like electricity, sweetness layered with something he could not name. Not tea, not barley. Nothing he knew. And before he could stop it, something shifted in him. Not surrender, not forgiveness. Just a crack in the wall he'd spent years building. A tiny, stubborn crack where ordinary life slipped through. Across the table, an older sergeant stared through the steam rising from his food. He'd been in charge of a gun crew before things fell apart, before the last ration on the last day in the last dusty hole. He chewed slowly. His eyes shimmered and hardened. He would not let tears come. But years later, when he spoke of that first meal, he would remember the warmth of the bun in his hand and the way the bottle left a ring of cold on the table. He would remember that the enemy's food didn't taste like victory or defeat. It tasted like a world that existed even during war. A world where people set tables instead of firing lines. What do you do with tenderness when you've prepared for cruelty? Where do you put it? Outside the mess hall, the yard made a small, workmanlike rectangle of snow and slush. Inside, men found that their voices came back to them, tentatively. They asked for words in a language they didn't know how to shape. Bread. Water. Salt. Thank you. Thank you. That night in the barracks, the bunks were layered with wool blankets and stamped numbers. The stoves clanged. Someone coughed the steady cough of a winter chest. The guards did a final count, and the room went quieter. Not silent, but quiet in a way that allows thinking to grow. A few men pressed their hands to their bellies, surprised to feel something like fullness. Across the aisle, a man turned his face into the pillow and let the tears go, silently, so no one would have to acknowledge them. They had not been tortured. They had not been humiliated. They had been fed. The next morning, voices began to map the camp, the mess, the yard, the latrines, the infirmary. Rules were recited, punishments outlined. The work parties would be organized, the schedules posted. The Red Cross would visit and check the lists. Mail would come and go, though not quickly, not reliably. No promises were made that could not be kept. That was its own kind of disorientation. At roll call, one guard, young, with a nose reddened by the cold, tried a word in halting Japanese. Good morning? It came out crooked. A few POWs looked up despite themselves. A few looked away, offended or startled or simply too tired to sort those feelings from the hunger that still remembered last night's bread. Later that week, a chaplain walked the yard, hands in his coat, breath fogging. He spoke of services in a frame house by the fence. Attendance was voluntary. Some men went, curious about the hush inside. Others stayed away, wary of an invisible net. A handful gathered in their own corners to whisper prayers they had learned under other roofs. People need rhythm. War breaks it. The camp, with all its fences and schedules, built a new one, whether the prisoners wanted it or not. Work began, and with it, an uneasy clarity. They were not being punished. They were being put to use. Some joined woodcutting crews, their breath sawing with the blades. Others hauled crates, stacked supplies, swept floors, repaired fences, sorted clothing from quartermaster piles. It was not the labor that stung. It was the dull fact of routine. Routine insinuates itself as mercy. It is also a reminder that time keeps moving, even when your life feels paused. During a cold noon break, an American worker from the civilian mill lit a cigarette. He offered the pack to the nearest POW. The man hesitated, then took one. The worker cupped the match. Their heads bent toward the flame, and for a moment, the world was only the circle of light cupped between them. The smell of sulfur, the first curl of smoke. When they lifted their heads, the worker spoke a name, his own, and the POW repeated it, careful around the edges. Then the POW offered his name, a different music, and the worker tried it on, mouth reshaping itself to fit. A few weeks in, the snow began to recede into gray mounds. The camp smelled of damp wool and oiled metal. In the mess hall, a cook pinned a handwritten note near the serving line. Welcome in several languages. The handwriting was blocky, the vowels long. It was both crude and generous. People noticed. One afternoon, a crate arrived with more of the brown bottles. The camp had coffee most mornings. It had tea sometimes, but those bottles became the shorthand for an unlikely ritual. Men saved them for the days when the wind cut too hard. They learned to tap the cap, to twist the opener without spraying the foam, to savor the fizz as an experience as much as a taste. More than once, somebody laughed out loud at the way the bubbles tickled the nose, and the laugh made other laughs happen, like sparks catching dry grass. There were letters. Eventually, wrapped in brown paper or slipping out of envelopes shyly, they carried news that landed like stones or like feathers. A mother's signature, a sister's memory of the dog, a neighbor's rumor that the old shop might reopen after the war. Some letters were edged in silence, words clipped by censors, ink smudged where tears fell before the page dried. The men who received no letters watched the others with a complicated mix of relief and envy. It is easy to forget that hope can be a burden. It is not easy to carry either. The first argument about baseball started in the yard and ended in laughter neither side expected. A handful of Americans were throwing and catching. The arc of the ball turned the air into a game. One prisoner tilted his head, measuring the distance. Another asked a guard, in the rough trade tongue that grows between languages, for a turn. The guard hesitated, then shrugged and lobbed him the ball. The prisoner threw. The throw was too straight, too eager. The guard flinched and caught it anyway. Shoulders loosened. More throws. Then a makeshift game. Feet dug into mud. Someone slid and swore in English. Someone else laughed in Japanese, then covered his mouth, surprised at his own body remembering the impulse to laugh. That night, in the barracks, a young man recounted the game to the man on the upper bunk. He used his hands to show how the ball flew, how the glove snapped shut. The words did not come easily. He used sounds and gestures to fill the gaps. But the memory landed. For a few minutes, their world included a white ball tracing a clean curve through clean air. The fences did not vanish, but they softened. In the infirmary, a medic changed a dressing and told a story about his kid sister's birthday cake collapsing in the oven. His voice softened on the word sister in a way he would not have allowed on the street. The patient blinked at the light and asked, haltingly, about the flavor. Chocolate. The medic used his hands to show the cake falling. The patient smiled despite the sting of antiseptic. Pain is honest. So are jokes about fallen cakes. No one pretends that war is redeemed by a bottle of soda or a hot sandwich. Pain does not politely leave when you feed it. Home does not suddenly come into focus because someone says, "Welcome," in block letters. But the body knows what the mind refuses. Nourishment is a language. It speaks whether you understand the words or not. Not everyone softened. Some men hardened further, insulted by the mercy. Kindness can humiliate when your code says you should already be dead. One man refused every offer of sweets, every extra pat of butter. He ate what he had to, and nothing more. He folded his blanket into a precise rectangle every morning and set his boots parallel beneath the cot, as if crisp lines alone could keep the world from fraying. His anger was not loud, but it was real. It sat beside him at meals and followed him to the yard. He had been taught a shape for honor. He did not know where to put it here. Another man, the one who had laughed when the soda fizz tickled his nose, kept a small notebook tucked into his jacket. He wrote down the names for ordinary things as he learned them, testing each word like a coin against his teeth. Bread, knife, Sunday. He gave himself little tests at night, whispering the words to the ceiling. He would not have called this hope. He would have called it necessity. The necessity of not letting the world shrink. Beyond the fence, the war continued with a ruthlessness that chewed through maps and families. The newsboards in the camp thumbtacked headlines for anyone who could read English or for those who found someone to translate quietly beside the board. The messages never said everything. How could they? A line on a board, a line in a letter, A line in a man's face. None of it holds the weight of cities. Spring came uneasy, with mud first and then lilac. The camp stung of bleach and boiled potatoes. The cooks experimented. Onions seared darker. Coffee poured a little stronger on a Sunday. A new batch of rolls brushed with butter and warmth. The prisoners lined up, count steady. Faces no longer a uniform gray, but a shifting palette of thoughts they were learning to have again. One afternoon, a crate of fresh produce arrived from a local farm. Tomatoes, bright as stamps. Lettuce with dirt still clinging to the roots. The cook held up a tomato like a prize, and someone near the back of the line clapped, causing the clap to echo unexpectedly around the hall. It turned into a joke told later in the barracks, cheering for vegetables. And the joke became a way to make the day have edges, a way to put a lid on fear and call it humor. On laundry day, steam turned the yard into a fog. Sheets snapped like flags. A guard, off-duty but passing through, stopped to trade curses in jest with a POW who had learned the shape of those words first, because everyone learns the curse words first. Both men pretended not to enjoy the silly danger of it. Both did. The camp library, small as a closet, with shelves scavenged from somewhere else, grew into a refuge. Books in English, a phrase book with the spine repaired by tape, a magazine with pictures of a family around a dinner table, a roast on a platter, a photograph of a boy on a bicycle, 1 foot hovering off the ground like a promise. Men stared at the pictures longer than they read the captions. You can translate a picture into any language you want. It will still tell you the truth it contains. Sunday afternoon, a harmonica floated across the yard. Very little else moved. The sound was thin and hopeful. Someone in the second barracks hummed along. Someone on the third cot from the door tapped his foot. It was not a song any of them had known before. It became one they would never forget. Weeks lengthened into months. The men learned the peculiar comfort of predictability and the peculiar suffering it brought. When you know what tomorrow looks like, you also know how long it will be until tomorrow ends. In that span, they planted tiny gardens along the edges of the yard, unauthorized but tolerated. A few stalks of green shot up like defiance. The soil was mean, but it gave. You learn to love any earth that lets you grow something. One evening, as dusk made the yard into a shadow theater, a guard told a joke that did not translate well. He laughed at his own joke, alone. Then he tried again, slower, leaning on the parts that might cross the bridge. A prisoner, older, with a slyness around the eyes, offered the punchline back to him, reshaped, brightness tucked into it like a secret. The guard stared and then laughed anew, delighted at the way the joke came home changed and somehow better. For a moment, they were just men, pleased to have made each other laugh. For a moment, that was a strange, complete victory. Not every memory can be born. Some fall away the moment you turn from them. Others return unbidden, triggered by a smell from a kitchen, by the hiss of a bottle opened in a summer yard decades later. In those remembered flashes, the men do not recall policy debates or codes or lectures. They remember texture, the way cardboard softened when wet, the way the mess hall light made shadows sharp under the rim of a metal tray, the way a first bite forced the mouth to admit that joy and sorrow can sit together on the same tongue. Some wrote about it years later, guarded, cautious accounts of daily life. They wrote about the snow and the smell of pine. They wrote about afternoons where nothing happened except the ordinary miracle of hot food. They wrote about a word they learned that winter and carried home like a flint in a pocket, a word that unlocked new rooms in themselves, rooms where kindness wasn't a trick, where survival didn't require shutting every window against the wind. Others never wrote a word. They carried the memory like an ember tucked into ash. It glowed sometimes, it hurt sometimes. It stayed because some moments do. Would any of this have mattered if the fences had not also held? If the men had not also absorbed humiliations anxieties, the constant ache of not knowing, perhaps it would still have mattered, because it is not about balance, as if a hamburger could counter a battle, as if a bottle could balance a bombardment. It is about interruption. War is a machine. Mercy is grit in its gears. Years from that winter, one of the men, white-haired, hands steady even in old age, would find himself standing in a kitchen not his own. Children would be underfoot. The radio would be playing softly, nothing impressive, just the sound of a home being a home. He would be asked politely if he would like a drink. There would be a pause in him, a pause that others attributed to age. He would take the offered bottle, crack the cap, and hear the small hiss. The fizz would rise. In that sound, a barracks would assemble itself once more. A mess hall would light. Snow would lift around a train. He would smile, and the children would think the smile was for them. It would be for them. It would also be for boys he had not seen since that winter. Boys who tasted an enemy and found, instead, a flavor of ordinary life. The winter at camp did not absolve him. It did not erase anything, but it gave him something to measure the world against. It taught him that dignity is not a medal pinned to your chest. It is the way you hold your tray in a line of tired men. It is the way you say thank you to someone whose language shapes the breath in his throat differently from yours. It is the way you learn the name of a game and throw the ball so it can be caught. And, always, it is the way you remember that the first sip of sweetness after a long bitterness is not a truce with your enemy. It is a truce with your own heart. As the months turned, rumors moved through the camp like weather. Some said they would be moved farther inland. Some said exchange. Some said the war would be over by harvest. None of the rumors mattered until they did. And then they mattered more than the weather. Men learned to hold hope at arm's length like a hot pan. Too close, and it burns. On a summer day that smelled of cut grass and sun-warmed wood, the mess hall staff decided to make a small celebration of nothing. No anniversary, no victory. Just a day when the deliveries arrived on time and the ovens behaved. They made more hamburgers than usual. The trays came out fast and hot. The buns stacked in tall columns like city blocks. Bottles, again, arranged in crates like a stained glass window laid flat. One of the cooks, wiping his forehead with his sleeve, said to no one in particular, "Everybody gets a second if they want." He said it the way a farmer talks about rain, not as a miracle, but as a piece of luck to be named so it isn't wasted. There were seconds. There were thirds. There was laughter from the back table when someone tried to show a friend how to balance two bottles in one hand and nearly lost both. A guard scolded him lightly and then showed him a better grip. And in the small choreography of hands and glass and pretend sternness, a truth showed itself. Survival is not only about breath and blood. It is about having a day you can call good without apology. That night, a storm rolled in and peppered the roofs with rain. The sound was relentless and comforting, like 1,000 whispers that didn't require answers. In the dark, a man on the top bunk told a story in a low voice. It was not a story about war. It was about a childhood summer when they were told that capture meant dishonor and death. They were told that the enemy would strip them of dignity. But when the train doors slid open in the biting Wisconsin cold, what waited for them was something none of them had been trained to imagine. The wind struck first, cold like a blade, clean and merciless. Breath turned to steam, and boots crunched on a crust of ice as they stepped down, blinking. They stood in a staggered line, faces wind-burnt, uniforms torn or patched, fingers wrapped in thin cloth to hide the trembling. The white sky pressed low over the camp, fences running tautly in long, straight lines. A shape like a low gray barn, mess hall, waited with windows fogged from warmth inside. They braced for cruelty. They found heat. Inside, the air stunned them. It smelled like onions and butter, and something rich and charred that snapped at the senses. Sizzle, pop, hiss. the sound of fat meeting hot iron. Laughter, even, somewhere from the kitchen. A man with forearms thick as oars, sliding a metal spatula under a patty. Another opening a crate with brown bottles that glinted like amber. A voice in careful Japanese broke the spell. An interpreter, a young man with American boots and a Japanese face. "Line up, please. You will be fed." One at a time, the prisoners exchanged glances. Was this a trick? Beyond the interpreter stood soldiers wearing wool coats and knitted caps, rifles slung, but no one shouted. No one shoved. The nearest guard nodded, an awkward nod, as if he understood the strangeness of the moment and did not want to break it. They moved forward in small, hesitant steps. The first tray slid across, metal on metal. On it, a round of bread cut in half, holding a disk of brown meat, a smear of bright red sauce, a crisp green chip of something that smelled like vinegar and dill. Next to it, a bottle, dark, cold, capped in silver. The bottle clicked when set down. The cap hissed off with a bird-like cry, "Psst!" and tiny beads of water ran down the glass like rain on lacquer. The prisoner looked from the tray to the interpreter, and then to the guard. He bowed, more instinct than intention, and sat at the edge of a long table. The first bite was a question. He expected grease and salt. He expected disappointment. Instead, he tasted heat and sweetness. A soft bun giving way to a patty that leaked juice, a sharp relish bright as pickled plum, a sour snap of pickle breaking through. The meat was not delicate. It was blunt and honest, like a hammer. He took a second bite, then a third, faster. When he lifted the bottle, the chill shocked his fingers. The first sip struck his tongue with bubbles that felt like 1,000 tiny needles. Sweetness followed, unapologetic, rushing, caramel and spice and something like citrus. He swallowed, and a laugh, small and astonished, leapt from him unbidden. He tried again, testing, lips tingling, throat sparkling, as if the drink itself were alive and mischievous. "Coca-Cola," the interpreter said softly in Japanese, as if the syllables themselves should be handled carefully. "A cola." The prisoner nodded, not because he understood, but because he suddenly wanted to. He brought the bottle to his lips again, the cold kissing his mouth. He placed it down and looked at the cap, silver, starburst edges, then tucked it into his pocket as if it were some strange coin. Around him, the others ate, slowly at first, then with hunger, then with shameless hunger, the kind that makes a sound, small groans, breathy hums of satisfaction, the soft slap of palms on tables to thank the cook without words. One man began to cry, not from sadness exactly, but from the release of some cord inside that had been pulled too tight for too long. He covered his face. His shoulders shook. No one mocked him. The guard beside him tightened his mouth, eyes brightening in a way that looked like windburn but wasn't. They had been told Americans would torture them. They had been told Americans would starve them. The enemy broke them not with whips, but with bread, not with chains, but with cola and meat and the unsentimental mercy of a hot meal. The cook in the kitchen, Frank, from Milwaukee, watched them in quick glances, kept flipping patties, kept laying cheese, kept moving. He'd cooked for lumbermen and for longshoremen, for boys in baseball caps, and men with hands that shook from factory lines. He set his jaw and cooked for the enemy, too. The spatula clicked the grill. The smell rose. He did not know what to do with the knot in his chest. The interpreter, Kenji to his mother, Ken to the sergeant, kept his voice even and his words simple. "If you need more, you may ask. 1 bottle each for now." He swallowed. He had cousins on the other side of the ocean. He had been told many things about duty and shame. He stood between 2 worlds and felt both pressing gently against his ribs. Outside, a crow traced the sky, black against the white. Inside, warmth wrapped itself around the room like a blanket. They were fed, and in that feeding, something complicated and invisible took root. Not all of them ate quickly. One man sat with his hands in his lap, watching the burger cool. He was a corporal from Osaka, a baker's son. He had never seen bread like this, soft, sweet, yielding. In his father's shop, bread had crust. It barked at your teeth. This bun nuzzled your mouth instead. He lifted the top and saw the red smear, the yellow smear, the slick of melted cheese. He looked at the bottle again, the hiss of it still in his ears. There was a trembling in his jaw that had nothing to do with the cold. He had promised himself 1,000 small vows in the last months. Do not laugh. Do not flinch. Do not accept what is given by the enemy. He thought of his mother's rice, his father's bread, his brother's letters. He thought of the lecture from the company officer about capture and shame, that circling hawk of a word. Shame. Always finding a place to land. He lifted the burger. He took a bite. He closed his eyes. The first swallow was surrender of a different kind. Later, in the barracks, the story of the hamburger spread with a speed that made it sound like rumor. The meat, the softness, the bottle with its sting of bubbles. Men cupped their hands in the cold air and mimed the drink, letting their cheeks puff out in mock surprise. And for the first night since the train, something like laughter rippled through the wooden ribs of the building. But sleep came hard, not because of hunger now, but because of what hunger had become. The warmth of the mess hall made the bunks colder by comparison. In the darkness, the barracks hummed with a different sound, the murmur of 100 men choosing to be alive in the same place. A guard walked the perimeter, scarf to his nose, breath like smoke. He could smell onions still, faint and stubborn, clinging to his gloves. He thought about the man who had cried. He did not tell anyone about the way he himself had looked away so the man could keep his face, even among enemies. Morning rose pale and brittle. The camp showed itself in detail. Fences cross-hatched with frost. A flag that refused to move in the still air. Crows perched like punctuation marks at the ends of bare branches. Work details were assigned. A list of rules, of hours, of expectations arrived through Ken's careful Japanese. Some of the rules made sense. No running toward the fence, no gathering in large clusters without a reason. Lights out times. Some of them seemed made to irritate. The exact number of men in a latrine at once. The distance between bunks. The prisoners nodded, some with visible reluctance, some with relief. The comfort of a structure that made a new survival map. There were classes, too, unbelievably. English lessons for those who wanted to learn. Library hours. A dance night for the American guards and secretaries in a hall the prisoners would never enter. The swing music carrying through the crisp air as a taunt or a gift, depending on how the ear bent to receive it. Baseball on Sundays. A chapel. Letters home, when censors allowed them. Sometime mid-morning, a man who had refused the bottle the night before asked quietly if he could try the cola. Ken hesitated only a second before nodding. The cook handed him a bottle without a word. The man lifted it with both hands as if it were an offering tray. The cap hissed. He brought the bottle to his lips so carefully it looked like prayer. He did not laugh, as the other had. He simply lowered the bottle and nodded once, solemnly, a judge acknowledging a case well argued, and then drank again. To eat a hamburger is to be told, in a language not of words, that you will be allowed to live. In its weight and simplicity is a message. You will be kept alive long enough to digest this. You may be human here for the length of this meal. To drink a Coca-Cola is to be amused by your own mouth. To have bubbles fling themselves at your tongue and your nose, to splutter, and then try again because a sweet thing has invited you into a new kind of childishness. It is a beverage designed for a country that has never had enough reason to surrender joy. Some men found this violent in its own way. They felt their resolve soften like butter left near a stove. They resented the comfort, the way it eroded edges. They ate anyway, others let themselves be washed in it. They had seen enough hard things. They would not pretend to be made only of hard things. Interrogations came, of course, in a small room that smelled like paper and coffee. Officers asked precise questions about units and supply lines and the dull geometry of war, and the prisoners answered or did not answer, careful as chess. There were tricks, perhaps, but not the ones they had been taught to fear. The most effective tactic, the prisoners would later say among themselves, was the neutrality of the questions. What was the caliber of the machine gun you carried? How many days' rations were issued before your last march? How long between messages? Ken sat in a corner during many of these sessions, translating with a voice that never rose above calm. He watched something subtle happen in the room, where fear had primed the body for violence. The absence of it inflamed confusion instead. He translated that, too. Confusion into hesitance, hesitance into answers. After each session, men returned to the mess hall and ate. They began to form a ritual. A burger on the first day of a new week. A hamburger became a kind of calendar. "It is Monday," someone would say, grinning. "Our American rice." There was a man they called the botanist. He was not a botanist, not formally, but he had a habit of noticing plants. The camp to him was a gallery of alien leaves. He learned the words in English and then taught them back to the others. "Oak," he said, tapping a leaf with deep rounded lobes. "Maple," pointing at a star. He taught the word evergreen and smiled at its logic. When the bottle caps piled up on his shelf, he arranged them like petals around a small, flat stone. A private joke about a flower that tasted like lightning. He had kept a notebook through the march and the surrender, filled with drawings of weeds and trees and mosses on rocks. Now he sketched pickles, cross-sections, seeds, their arch. He drew a hamburger and wrote the English word beneath it, letters careful as seeds placed in rows. Hamburger. He drew the bottle of cola and shaded the glass with a patience that made it shine on paper. For months he had recorded only the stubbornness of things. Now he recorded their generosity too. At first, the men watched the American guards with the same intensity that prey devotes to learning the habits of predators. What time they changed shifts, which ones squinted in the sun, and which ones cracked their knuckles, which ones kept their hats square and which ones wore them like straying birds. Slowly, reluctantly, unevenly, the study shifted. They learned instead which ones would trade a story for a story, which ones had a pocketful of gum, which ones would try out a word or two in Japanese if you gave them just enough time to gather courage. In return, the prisoners revealed scraps of themselves. A man from Kagoshima confessed that he had never seen snow before this winter. Another, from Hokkaido, scoffed and taught them a dozen words for snow. Wet snow, wind-blown snow, heavy snow, old snow, with the delight of a fisherman teaching knots. Someone folded paper into cranes from a torn envelope. The crane passed from hand to hand, its wings gaining the grease of a dozen admirers. Frank, the cook, began to watch for the ones who ate too quickly, who gulped as if the plate might be yanked away. He learned to keep one extra patty warming under a metal dome just for them. He never announced it. He simply slid the burger into the gap in front of the man, just as his plate emptied. Surprise bloomed each time, and with it, something Frank did not have a name for. Pride, maybe, or relief that he could be this kind of man in a world that kept offering other kinds. On a day when another would sit in a restaurant in Tokyo, long after that winter, and order a hamburger because he wanted to, because he could. He would lift the bun, and the smell would bring back a snow-bright day, and a cook with big hands, and an interpreter who spoke like a bridge. He would eat, and the meat would be neither better nor worse than the one he remembered, and it would not matter. The memory was what was being eaten with ketchup. And Frank, old now, would find a bottle cap in a drawer while looking for a screwdriver. He would turn it in his fingers and remember the way surprise looked in a stranger's face. He would not say the word mercy out loud either. He would simply close the drawer and start the kettle and stand there a moment while the water thought about boiling. What broke in that winter was not resolve. It was a story. The story that said the enemy is only a jaw to be clenched against, a shadow to be thrown knives at, a shape to be reduced and refused. The story that said dignity is preserved by refusing what is offered, even when what is offered is a warm plate to hold your hands over. The story that said to be fed is to be weak. Instead, another story was told by the hiss of a bottle and the weight of bread, that to allow yourself to taste is not to betray the dead, that to swallow is not to surrender, that to find solace in a sweet thing does not unmake your losses. That winter, they learned the enemy had a flavor. They did not forget the other flavors, the iron taste of fear, the smoke of loss, the ash of shame. They carried those too. The mouth is big enough for complexity. It is, in fact, what it was made for. On a day when the snow melted enough to reveal stubborn grass, one of the men, the baker's son from Osaka, lingered at the fence and watched a boy ride past on a bicycle beyond the camp. The boy wore no hat. His hair glowed in the pale sun like straw. He balanced a paper bag on the handlebars, and when a dog barked at him, he threw back his head and barked right back, bright and ridiculous. The baker's son laughed. It escaped him, startled and glad. He turned and walked toward the mess hall where lunch had already made the inside. The air stunned them. It smelled like onions and seared meat, and a sweetness that none of them could name. Heat pooled at the windows, ran along the ceiling, and softened the raw ache in their fingers. They stood, not sure whether to step forward or brace for orders, until a man with a pale face and a red knit cap lifted both hands and said, "Easy. One line. One tray each." His voice was even, neither kindness nor cruelty, just a workman's tone. The prisoners glanced at each other, reading eyes and shoulders, as if leadership might be hiding in a breath. A nod. A sergeant near the back called softly in Japanese, "Stay together. Do as they say." He sounded as if his throat had been scraped raw by winter. They shuffled into a line, boots leaving damp, dark scuffs on the mess hall floor. A cook slid a dented metal tray across the counter. He was heavy-set, with a grin that seemed to belong to another world, a world that hadn't learned the names of Pacific islands. "Welcome to lunch, fellas," he said. They didn't know the words, but they recognized the tone. On the tray, a soft golden bun cupped a brown, glistening patty. Something red and bright had been smeared across it. A pale ring of onion lay under a sheet of yellow that didn't look like cheese, but smelled like it. Beside it sat a mound of pale slaw and a handful of salted chips. And then the bottle, greenish glass, curves like a river pebble, a crown cap still sealed tight. Coca-Cola. The first man in line, a private with a long scar that cut from ear to the corner of his mouth, stared as if the food might test him. He had memorized 1,000 rules about how to stand, how to bow, how to die. There had been fewer rules about how to eat your enemy's food. He lifted the burger with both hands, thumbed the bun as if testing a pistol's weight. The warmth surprised him. It yielded, soft and fragrant, buttered and toasted just enough to whisper when he pressed. He looked left, then right. Someone behind him, a boy with a farmer's hands, tilted his head. "Go ahead." He bit. The shock of fat and salt and sweetness, the crunch of onion, the little burst of briny pickle against the heat of meat. He froze, chewing, eyes widening. The room quieted around his chewing, or maybe the world did. The flavors didn't translate into words he'd used before. They were shameless in their pleasure. He swallowed, breath caught halfway between shame and relief. And when he breathed again, he felt heat lift in his chest, like laughter he didn't quite allow. The second man tried. Then the third. The line moved. Caps hissed off bottles. The first sip of Coca-Cola stung the tongue. Sparks under the nose. A dance of bubbles that felt like tiny needles and joy. It tasted like a holiday no one had told them about. It was cold enough to ache behind the eyes and sweet enough to melt the grip of the march out of them. They had learned to swallow pain. This was different. This they wanted to hold in the mouth, to delay, to repeat. At another table, one of the guards, young, freckled, with a knitted brown scarf speckled with frost, watched their faces and softened. He leaned back, chair creaking, and murmured to his buddy, "First time." The buddy nodded. "Hope the cook didn't go heavy on the onions," he said, and they both smiled without mockery. A prisoner near the end of the line held his bottle without opening it, eyes fixed on the little white letters curling on the glass. English script looked like vines to him. He traced the curve with his finger, felt the embossed glass, the cool weight. He had been taught to despise such symbols. Now he turned the bottle and found it beautiful in a way that unsettled him. When the cook reached over with a church key and snapped the cap off, the prisoner flinched at the sound, then laughed at himself, and then didn't quite know what to do with his laughter. He drank. The world cracked open. They ate until the last chip was gone, until the slaw had been picked apart and tasted cautiously, until fingers gleamed and napkins blotted them dry. They ate like men who had walked long in a cold that tried to take their names. After, the noise of the mess hall rose. Not loud, not celebratory, but fuller, voices climbing out of their chests. Someone tried English. "Thank you." It came out bent, but the cook nodded as if it were perfect. A few prisoners bowed awkwardly, and the cook, flustered, almost bowed back before catching himself and wiping his hands on his apron. Outside, the sky stayed a white bowl over the camp. Inside, the heat and the taste sank into memory like a stone into a deep lake, rippling outward. They were led to barracks, long rooms, wooden bunks, woolen blankets that smelled of soap and something else, like stored sunlight. The men stacked their few things. They looked at the lines of boots under the beds, at the racks for coats, at the little stove in the center, where a dull orange showed through vents. It was not home, but it had a structure that asked nothing of them except to live. That first night, hunger reached for them again, out of habit. It found them, for once, already fed. One man lay on his back, staring at the beams. He could not decide whether the taste of that meat had made him more ashamed or more human. He slept finally, mouth slightly open, as if still tasting. Morning brought routines. Roll call, work details. The winter's edge chewed at their ears and noses. They carried wood, shoveled paths, worked in a warehouse sorting sacks of flour and sugar, their breath blooming in the cold. A guard with a face pinked by wind showed them how to rub hands together slowly, palms and backs, to keep blood awake. Another taught them to wrap feet in newspaper before socks on the worst days, laughter bursting when they swayed like drunken men on one leg. They learned the camp's rhythms, the way the siren sounded at noon from far off, faint as a distant memory, and the way coffee smelled just before breakfast when the kitchen hatch opened. The mess hall returned, again and again. Not every day brought burgers. Sometimes there were stews, thick and brown, with carrots that softened on the tongue, and hunks of bread that gave under pressure. They learned hot cakes, the way syrup clung, the way butter slid in glossy rivers. They learned meatloaf, strips of ketchup on top like the flags of a country that loved sugar more than it had any right to. They learned to spread peanut butter and to understand that it tasted like childhood, though for them childhood had tasted like rice and fish and the sea. Between meals, Coca-Cola did not always appear, but when it did, the room shifted slightly, like a chord struck in a familiar song. One afternoon, after a shift moving crates, an older guard with a gray mustache, The kind that turned down at the ends as if tired of the world, brought a crate of bottles and set it on a table. "For the crew," he said. He tapped the wood, then turned to go. A young prisoner reached out without thinking and touched the crate, then pulled back, as if afraid the guard would accuse him of greed. The guard paused in the doorway. "Drink up," he said, and smiled with one side of his mouth. The hiss of bottle caps rose again, a small chorus. In the corner, a man named Sato, thin, eyes set deep as if always straining to see further, watched the bubbles climb and burst. He had followed rules so strictly that his spine had a permanent stiffness. He lifted the bottle and let the cold rest against his lower lip. When he drank, the sensation was so keen he almost cried. His father had taught him to fear sugar, to discipline himself against all softness. Now, he thought, what if the enemy is not only a destroyer, but a maker of pleasures we never imagined? The thought was dangerous. He drank again. They began, slowly, to talk to guards. English came in fragments and gestures. An American named Miller, tall and thin, drew a burger on a scrap of paper and labeled parts: bun, patty, cheese, onion, pickle. He said the words and waited as the prisoners repeated them. "Bun," they said, vowels softened. "Patty," he grinned. He pointed at himself. "Miller." He pointed at one of the men, compact and solid, with a face like a stone smoothed by river water. The prisoner hesitated. "Hayashi," he said at last. "Hayashi." Miller tried the sounds, careful, jaw working. "Hayashi," he repeated, and the man's shoulders dropped imperceptibly, as if a weight he didn't know he carried had been set down. In the evenings, a radio in the guard hut bled out swing, brass and drums, a kind of joy that refused to ask permission. The prisoners heard it through thin walls, caught melodies that made their feet restless. They did not dance, but they listened. Music did to the air what Coca-Cola did to the mouth. It lifted it, made it sparkle, made it possible to imagine a room without barbed wire. Winter softened, then hardened, then finally began to retreat. The trees around the camp blackened with wet. Snow pulled back from the edges of paths like a retreating army. The sky learned blue again. On one of the first warm afternoons, Miller held up a baseball and a bat, pantomimed a swing, then pointed to the open ground. He raised his eyebrows. The men looked at each other. Several nodded, cautious and shy. They learned the weight of the bat, the way the ball felt in the palm, not like the wooden balls of their youth, but leathery and stitched. They learned the sound of a hit, a pure crack that made even the guards clap involuntarily. They learned to run and to laugh without looking over their shoulders for censure. For the first time in a long time, they celebrated one another's luck without feeling it was a betrayal. The game did not cure anything. It just stitched an hour shut in kindness. Food, always, threaded through it. At the end of the game, someone produced a paper bag of buns from the mess. Another man arrived with a tray, carrying patties slick with their own fat, covered and still breathing heat. On a makeshift table, 2 crates and a plank, Miller and Hayashi built burgers side by side. Miller squeezed a swirl of ketchup. Hayashi copied him, hand a little uncertain, then bold. They both laughed at the smears that went wide. Miller bit first, declared it perfect with his mouth full. Hayashi bit, closed his eyes a fraction, then opened them brighter. He raised his Coke. The bottles clicked in a clumsy toast. Not everyone surrendered to these moments. Some men sat apart, faces tight, hands still. They held to their training like a rope across a ravine. Survival did not soften the old commandment that capture meant failure. The taste of beef and sugar complicated their shame. One night in the dim barracks, a man wept silently into his blanket. Another reached across, touched his shoulder, and said nothing. Because what words would be right when the world was both kinder and crueler than you had prepared for? Letters came slowly. Red Cross forms, censors' stamps. Some learned that homes had burned, that brothers were missing, that no one had news. Others learned that wives were safe in villages untouched by the worst. A few learned that fathers had refused to speak their names after capture. The room held these facts without argument. Men ate in the mess hall, drank their sodas, then went back to their bunks to hold news like a hot coal. In time, the burgers and the Coca-Cola were not surprises. They were part of the weave. Yet, there remained that first memory, sharp as the bite of a winter apple, the shock of sweetness, the way steam rose off a patty on a plate, the way onion bit and then melted. In the ethics they had been taught, pleasure had rarely been a friend. In the ethics of the camp, pleasure was a tool the Americans wielded as deftly as fences and rules. But it did something else too, something perhaps the Americans themselves did not entirely intend. It humanized both sides. It lifted men momentarily out of the machinery of war and slotted them into the machinery of a lunch line, which is to say, into normal life. One day, a chaplain visited, a man with delicate hands and tired eyes. He spoke slow, searching for words that crossed the space between. He talked not of doctrine, but of seasons, of how snow surrenders to mud and mud to grass, of how the tongue can forget bitterness when it learns new sweetness. He held up a bottle of Coca-Cola, grinned at the way men leaned in slightly even if they did not move their feet. "This," he said, "isn't salvation. It's just a drink. But sometimes a drink is more than its sugar." You didn't need English to understand his meaning. Another afternoon, a delivery truck rolled up, engine coughing. The driver, bored, flicked a cap off a bottle and took a pull before unloading crates. He looked over and saw the prisoners watching, a mixture of interest and restraint. He shrugged, walked over, and held out a bottle. The nearest man hesitated. The driver pointed at the bottle, then at the man's chest. "You," he said. "Go on." He placed it in the prisoner's hand. It was nothing, and it was extraordinary. Work changed with the season. Some were sent out to a farm where the fields pinned the horizon. The earth was black and heavy. They worked lifting and carrying, pruning and planting, moving in lines that reminded them painfully of home, of rice paddies and shouted directions and the rhythm of labor. At noon, farmers, old men with backs bent like question marks, women with strong wrists, brought out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and bottles standing like green chess pieces in a wooden crate. These were not camp rations. These were gifts measured in meat and fizz. One farmer looked at the prisoners eating and said to his wife in a voice both puzzled and tender, "They're just boys." His wife nodded, eyes lowering, and slipped an extra sandwich into a hand that had not asked. Burgers on the farm tasted sun-warmed by the time they reached mouths. The buns were a little dry, the onions a little sharp, the meat a little cool, but the taste carried that radiant streak of generosity. Coca-Cola tasted like a chorus of small freedoms, the cap's little report, the rush of bubbles up the neck of the bottle, the way the glass chilled fingers even in summer. For the first time, men stopped counting days like stones. They began to measure them by flavors. In the barracks, jokes rose. One man teased another about how he wiped ketchup from the edge of his mouth with the precision of a calligrapher. Another mimicked the way Miller overpronounced pickle. Eyes bright with mischief, laughter slid into cracks that had felt permanent. Once, at dusk, as the barracks hummed softly with talk and the scrape of boots on the floor, Hayashi sat on the edge of his bunk, rolling a bottle cap between thumb and forefinger. He pressed it into his palm until the ridges dented skin. He thought of his father's hands, right thumb scarred from a fishing hook, nails stained by sea and salt. He imagined placing this cap in his father's palm and saying, "I tasted a new world." He did not know whether his father would throw it away or keep it in a pocket and touch it at odd moments. Thoughtful, he closed his hand around the cap and put it under his pillow, like a boy hiding treasure. By late summer, the camp's mess had acquired a rhythm so steady that men could almost predict the day by the smell on the wind. Chilly Day carried cumin and a promise of cornbread. Chicken Day smelled like black pepper and the kind of grease that forms a happy sheen on lips. Hamburgers announced themselves before you saw them. The grill sang and the scent rose, a warm, smoky veil that settled over the yard. Men drifted toward it as if tethered. That day, Burger Day, a new group of prisoners arrived, faces pinched and suspicious. They wore the expression the older men remembered in themselves, a readiness to swallow shame and to resist comfort out of principle. In the mess, when the new men held the buns and sniffed, the room quieted, a kind of collective memory rising. The older men watched without intruding, as if attending a small rite. The first bite, the widening of the eyes, the way a man's shoulders dropped half an inch, the soft exhale. Yes, it was the same. The camp, for a heartbeat, became a temple of ordinary mercy. The new men drank Coke, and one of them coughed at the bubbles and then laughed, embarrassed, and then laughed more because he was embarrassed. The laughter spread. A guard looked up, surprised, as if he had never expected laughter to require no translation. War did not forget them. News filtered in like a storm heard from far away. Wind roaring over hills you cannot see. Battles with names they would learn only once. Names that would stick like burrs to history. Rolled forward and fell away. Posters in the guard office changed. The radio's songs thickened with speeches. Men counted losses they did not witness. Still, lunchtime arrived. Still, burgers hissed and Coke popped. In that repetition, they found a strange shelter. Autumn returned and laid copper over the trees. The air sharpened. If hot food had been a gift in winter, now it was a celebration against the lengthening dark. One evening, after a day on a work detail that left their hands split and their nails lined with dirt, the men filed in and paused. On the counter, beside the trays, sat a stack of wax paper packages. The cook winked and pushed one forward. Inside, a burger already built, wrapped like a present. Something about the neatness, the way grease stained the paper in a perfect circle, made men grin like boys. They unwrapped, steam puffed, and the first bite carried onions caramel sweet, cheese melted into a golden blanket, ketchup's bright tang, mustard's vinegary kick. Someone said, America, not as a flag, not as an enemy, but as a taste. The word shifted in the room. On a Sunday, the chaplain arranged for a small service. Men attended because it meant a different rhythm, not because of God. He spoke about stories. He said, "One day when you are old, you will tell young people about a train and a cold day and a line and a meal." He looked at their faces and changed course. You will tell them about a moment when you expected to be treated as an animal and were treated as a man. He held out his hands as if weighing outcomes. "There are many ways to break a man," he said. "Hunger is one. Kindness is another. But kindness can also mend. Be careful with this fact. It is heavier than it looks." That night, a guard off duty drifted near the fence with a cigarette he never lit and a bottle he never opened. He watched the barracks windows glow and dim. He thought of his own boyhood, in a town where the biggest excitement had been the Saturday picnic, and the smell of burgers on a grill that always needed repairing. He wondered at the way the world could be so simple and so cruel at once, and how a sandwich could be both a symbol and a sandwich. He set the bottle on a fence post and walked away, and later a prisoner found it there, a white napkin under it like a joke, and took it inside, and the room warmed further. Some nights, the men told each other stories of food from home, bowls of rice, steaming, glistening like tiny pearls, miso so salty it cured sorrow, pickles brined with secrets, fish grilled until the skin crackled. They described textures and sauces. They named markets and alleys. They conjured the sound of knives on wood. In answering stories, they named hamburger like a foreign cousin who had moved in and proved surprisingly gentle. They compared Coca-Cola to a festival lantern, bright, Unnecessary, exactly what the heart wanted. The shame never vanished. Not entirely. It lay under everything like a slow river under ice. But over it grew reeds and tracks, and even laughter. Men refined the ritual of burger eating. Some split buns to add more onion. Some hoarded pickles from friends who found them too sour. Some built with patience, aligning cheese corners, crafting a private geometry that promised the most balanced bite. To watch them at the long tables was to watch craftsmen, not prisoners. When the war's end came close enough to feel personal, closer than rumor, not yet fact, there was a peculiar silence, like the moment before a bottle cap flicks off. The guards grew taut. The prisoners grew inward. A day arrived on which news ran like electricity through the camp. Men cheered in spaces far away. In the mess hall, the cook set down his spatula and leaned on both hands and stared at nothing for a long time. Then he flipped another patty. He fed the room. A week later, orders shifted. Papers shuffled. Names were called. Some men would go here, some there. A map no one could see rearranged itself. On the last day before the first group's departure, Miller arrived at the mess early. He asked the cook for something, leaning close, speaking low. The cook frowned, thought, then nodded. He wiped his hands and went to work. At noon, the men filed in and stopped. On each tray, beside the burger, sat a second bottle of Coca-Cola. 2. The cook shouted across the din. "A day for seconds!" He didn't need to be understood. The meaning was a warmth without vocabulary. Men lifted their bottles. They did not toast victory or surrender or home. They toasted surviving a meal together. They toasted a taste that would go with them wherever they went, changing nothing and changing everything. Hayashi sat with his burger before him and the 2 bottles shining like small lighthouses. He remembered stepping off the train that first day. The shock of cold, the shock of kindness. He thought of his father, his mother kneeling by a low table, his brother laughing with rice stuck to his lip. He thought of Miller's careful mouth around his name. He took a bite. He took a drink. He let the sweetness sit behind his tongue. He measured this feeling. It did not fit into the categories he had carried into war. It was too simple for ideology and too complex for appetite. It was just this: being alive, with others, with food. When the first departure finally came, men stood where the train would be, not in the same fierce cold as before, but under a sky that threatened rain. They held small bundles. They looked out at nothing in particular. The mess hall door stood open behind them, heat spilling into the yard as if to follow. The cook came out, arms folded, then, impulsively, went back in and returned with a paper bag. He pressed it into Miller's hands, who shook his head, then was overruled by the cook's insistence. Miller walked down the line and put the bag into Hayashi's hands. Hayashi looked in. Inside, wrapped neat as always, a burger. Under it, cold and sweating, a bottle. Hayashi bowed without thinking, then straightened and met Miller's eyes. Miller lifted a hand, palm forward, a half wave. "Good luck," he said. The words were lost and understood anyway. The train came. Doors slid. Men climbed. The bag rested in Hayashi's lap as the car shuddered and moved. He waited. He wanted to eat while still on the ground, but somehow it felt right to carry the taste forward, to let it stand for a bridge rather than a destination. When the train cleared the camp and the fences fell away, and the sound of wheels on the track took over, he opened the bag. He ate slowly. He drank. He watched the land roll by, farm and wood, stream and long grass. "Welcome to lunch," he said, drawing the word out as if it might warm the room by itself. Burgers hot off the grill. The word meant nothing to most of them. Burger. It slid past ears like ice on metal. But the scent did not. It rose in waves. Meat, fat, onions softening in their own sweetness, something sharp and vinegary. A flat top hissed behind the counter. A hand reached, steady and practiced, flipped patties. The sound was a language the prisoners did understand. Heat meeting hunger. A tray clattered into the hands of the first man in line. A soft, pale bun landed with a whisper, then a thick disk of seared beef, juices freckling the metal tray. A spoonful of chopped onions. A tangle of something green and puckered. Pickles. A smear of yellow mustard. A red line of ketchup drawn like a flag. Beside it, a bottle stood upright, brown glass, beads of cold running down its neck. The label curved and looped in an alphabet none of them read, as ornamental as a temple carving. A hooked opener hung on a chain from the counter. The cook caught the cap, pressed, and with a crisp hiss it came free. The smell lifted, a dark sweetness, like caramel and smoke and winter fruit. They stared. "Go on," the man in the red cap said, nodding. "Eat while it's hot." The sergeant, the one with the sore throat voice, looked down the line. His eyes were a narrow slit against the light, measuring fear the way a carpenter measures wood. He took the tray, lifted the bun, and looked as if he might examine the meat as evidence. Then he lowered his head, brought the burger to his mouth, and bit. The first taste was heat, then salt, then fat and grain and something bright, the quick bite of the pickle, the lift of mustard. The bread was soft against the mouth, the meat firm, the juices chasing warmth down his throat. He chewed, swallowed, and in that swallow something gave way inside his chest, the smallest, most private surrender. He set the burger down. The men watched, held between suspicion and gravity. He lifted the bottle, hesitated a heartbeat, then drank. The liquid hit his tongue like a spark. Tiny drums of air burst one after the other. Sweetness unfurled. Not the neat sweetness of rice wine, but a darker, roasted thing that clung to his teeth and ran cold as it went down. It stung the back of his throat, and he coughed once, eyes watering. Then he went back for a second swallow. Longer, deeper. When he set the bottle down, the sound of glass on metal was clean and ringing, like a bell at morning. "Not poison," he said, quietly at first, then again so the men at the door would hear him too. "Not poison?" Something like a smile tugged at the corner of the cook's mouth. The line began to move. They ate, not with the frenzy of starving men, but with a stiff, careful gratitude, as if their hunger had to learn new manners. The room filled with the small, intimate sounds of eating, bread tearing, a low hum of breath, the shuffle of boots. One young private, barely whiskered, with hands too clean for the ragged cuffs of his coat, took his first bite and closed his eyes. He chewed as if he might memorize the motion so he could do it later in the dark. "Sweet," someone murmured, almost to himself, holding his bottle up to the light. "Amai." A man with a scar, bending his eyebrow into a question, turned the cap over and over in his fingers, as if there might be a message etched inside the tiny ridges. He slipped it into his pocket, like a coin he might spend in a world not ruled by wire and towers. At the far table, a guard leaned against the wall, trying to look like he was not watching. His jaw worked on a piece of gum. He had a face like a shovel, broad, blunt, all-purpose, and eyes that kept straying to the window, where the wind pushed powdery snow across the yard in little heaps. On his sleeve, a patch. On his finger, a ring. He took the measure of each man and found, instead of threat, an inventory of hunger and bone and winter. The young private with the clean hands glanced at his neighbor. "How do you—" He gestured vaguely at the bottles, the metal caps scattered like small helmets. The neighbor shrugged, lifted his bottle again, and grinned when the fizz tickled his nose. He laughed. One short, startled sound, and the men around him looked up as if a bird had flown through the mess hall. A man at the end of the table set his burger down with excruciating care. He was older, his hair clipped close, the skin around his eyes a map of narrow roads. He touched the bun with his fingertips, as if he might learn something by reading the softness of it. Bread, but not rice. He knew bread as a ration in the far north, hard and square, a punishment to the jaw. This bread yielded. It traveled from hand to mouth without a fight. He felt vividly the absence of rice in his stomach, and the thought came with neither longing nor contempt, only the steady fact of it. He drank from the bottle, and in a rush of cold remembered a summer when he had been a child, and a peddler had come to the village with a crate of lemon soda, marble trapped in the neck of each bottle. They had stood in a semicircle and watched the marble drop, glass clink, fizz rise like a spell. He had thought then that sweetness was a kind of magic that adults controlled. Now, in the middle of a war, in a building where he was counted and fenced, sweetness found him anyway. The sergeant finished his burger and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before he realized a stack of brown paper napkins sat at the edge of the table. He took one, folded it precisely in half, and dabbed at the corners of his lips with the same care a man brings to cleaning a weapon. Across from him, a slender man with a teacher's posture, back straight despite the cold, peeled his burger apart and examined it. He made a note in his head the way he might have written in the margin of a student's composition: beef, pickles, sour, mustard, sharp, bread, soft, onions, sweet. He looked for rice in the architecture of the meal and found instead an order that moved from the top down, bun to meat to bun again. He took a bite and felt like he had stepped from a room he knew into one he did not, and the air was a different temperature. "Eat up," the cook said, passing by with a tub of extra pickles, his breath making ghosts as it left his mouth. "Plenty." He set the tub down, metal on wood, and for the smallest second his gaze met the sergeant's. It was not a truce, and not a treaty, just a human acknowledgment lit by the steam of the kitchen. They ate until the heat of food spread from their bellies outward, until their fingers worked again, and their shoulders came down from around their ears. The last of the bottles clinked as they were drained. The room filled with the low, almost contented speech of men who, for the first time in days, were not negotiating with pain. Afterward, they filed back into the cold, their breath pulling white banners behind them. The snow had lightened, the sky a flat pewter with a thin seam of brightness at the horizon. The camp showed itself. Long barracks like boxcars laid side by side, a wire fence that seemed more tired than menacing, towers at the corners with shapes inside, guards or shadows. Somewhere a dog barked exactly twice, then decided the world could do as it liked. The barracks smelled of wood smoke and wool. A potbelly stove in the center ticked and breathed. Bunks ran in two lines along the walls, mattresses thin but real, blankets folded. A sign on the far wall in two languages explained rules in square, unyielding sentences. No one bothered to read it right away. They stood, each man finding a place he might call his own, throwing their bundles onto the lower bunks with a possessiveness that surprised them. The sergeant took a corner, sat and stared at his hands, flexing them, turning them palm up, palm down, as if they might disclose secrets. He felt the poisoned enchantment of well-being. Somewhere in him a voice warned that softness was a trap. Another voice, quieter and more honest, answered, "Not everything that soothes is poison." "Do you think," the young private said, settling on the edge of a bunk as if a gust might knock him off, "that they will always feed us like that?" The older man with the clipped hair considered. "No," he said, "not always like that, but not like the stories either." "What stories?" another asked from the top bunk, swinging his legs down, his boots sending a small spray of melted snow onto the floor. He didn't answer directly. He looked at the bottle cap he had pocketed, shiny even in the dim light, and turned it like a tiny compass, wondering what it would point to if it had a needle. The door opened. An American stepped in, his boots clapping the floor. He wore a greatcoat and held a clipboard, the kind of rectangle that made a man both official and vulnerable. With him came a smaller man in uniform without a coat, jaw set, eyes quick. When he spoke, The words came out in Japanese, crisp and careful, as if each consonant had been ironed. "I'm here to interpret," he said, and something like a ripple went through the room. Some of the men stared openly. Others lowered their eyes. He was Japanese by blood, his face telling the story before his tongue did. But the uniform he wore told another story, sharp and starched in American lines. The strange arithmetic of war had added him up and landed on this answer: both. The man with the clipboard spoke. The interpreter relayed, "You will be registered. You will receive identification. You will be assigned work details. The work is not punishment. It will be paid, small wages. You may use wages at the canteen. There are rules. There will be order. If you have questions, ask them through me." The sergeant's jaw tightened at the word wages. It seemed a cruel joke, a currency invented for a world that did not belong to him. Yet even as he resisted it, he imagined a bar of soap in his own hand, a pencil, the hard comfort of paper. "Letters," someone called. "Can we write?" The interpreter looked at the clipboard man. "Through the Red Cross," he said. "Short letters, censored." He did not soften the last word. The men nodded. Hope shares a bed with limitation more often than it admits. Another question, one that made the interpreter straighten. "Where will we be sent?" "For now," he said, "here. Then possibly to farms, to forests, to places that need hands more than guns." The American with the gum from the mess hall stepped into the doorway, his head tilting to catch the words, as if they were a song he could not quite hear the tune of. He chewed slower without noticing. The stove ticked. The room listened to its own breathing. That night, the wind sang low and patient at the edges of the building. The stove's glow flickered and settled. The men lay under blankets that smelled faintly of other men's sleep. Someone near the stove snored, then stopped, then started again, the hiccuping rhythm of a heart that had won another day. On the lower bunk by the far wall, the young private lay awake. He turned the Coca-Cola bottle in his hands, empty and clean, a ghost of taste left behind the glass. He traced the raised letters with a rough thumb and felt, as surely as if he could see it, the curve of the script his mouth could not pronounce. He thought of the marble in the old bottles at the summer festival. He thought of the sea, of islands spit up like teeth from a broken jaw. He thought of the first bite of meat and how the pickle's sour had surprised him like a slap, and then felt like a hand on his back. Somewhere in the dark, someone whispered a prayer, soft and shapeless, more a thank you to the act of breathing than to any god. He did not sleep for a long time. When he did, he dreamed in flavors. Morning came in the gray way winter brings it, without ceremony. The bell, no, not a bell, a man striking a length of pipe with a wrench, called them out. Faces brushed with sleep, hands shoved into pockets. They formed lines that knew how to be lines. The interpreter moved among them like a thread pulled through cloth, stitching one language to another. Names were counted, then turned into numbers. A guard issued each man a card that would show his identity for the purposes of this place. A photograph was taken. Chin here, eyes here. The camera's click folded them flat, their lives pressed thin and rectangular. Work parties were organized in lists. Some were sent to shovel, some to stack, some to patch canvas or mend crates. The sergeant and the teacher were assigned to a crew bound for the wood line that ringed the camp like a dark, patient thought. The young private found his name under kitchen, dish detail. He looked up to see the heavy-set cook's grin again, and could not stop the small smile that climbed uninvited onto his own face. He was embarrassed by it, but he did not hand it back to himself. In the kitchen, he learned the language of steam. He swabbed floors, racked plates, wiped counters clean enough to reflect the ghost of his face. He watched how the American cooks moved around each other without collision, a dance of elbows and hands that had nothing to do with military drill, and everything to do with 1,000 meals served. When they broke for 5 minutes, one of the men shoved a crate toward him with the rubber heel of his shoe. Inside, bottles lay like sleeping birds in straw. The man popped 2 caps and slid one across. "Here," he said. "For the dish crew." The private hesitated, then took the bottle. He drank, and the cold struck his teeth, the fizz tapping his tongue like tiny knockings on a door. He swallowed, and, invisible, undeniable, a thread tied the moment to the one from the day before. Taste as proof that time exists. On the edge of the camp, under trees that kept their secrets even in winter, the sergeant and the teacher lifted, stacked, measured, tied. The work put breath in their chests and soreness in their shoulders. That made sense. At midday, they sat on a stump and unfolded their lunch. Bread, apple, hard cheese, a small bottle that winked at them from the bottom of the bag. The teacher held the apple to his nose and caught a faint trace of spring hidden under the cold. Flowers remembered by fruit. He bit, and juice ran down into the space under his tongue. He laughed, a short bark that surprised even him. The sergeant took his first sip of the bottle and didn't cough this time. Progress, he thought, not as a strategy, but as a fact. Days stretched, then stacked. Snow changed its mind, melted, returned, then tired of the game. The mess hall became a place where hunger was attended to with regularity. The barracks learned their men's names the way houses do. A rhythm surfaced. Work, eat, rest, think, repeat. Between the beats, life crept in. A guard learned a word of Japanese, "thank you," and offered it like a coin he'd been saving for the right moment. A prisoner learned the word pickle and mispronounced it into something delicate and floral, and the men around the table repeated it until it felt like a joke they'd been telling for years. The canteen opened on a Tuesday. It was a small room with shelves that looked assembled from the idea of a store more than from the store itself. On them, treasures, soap, combs, pens, paper, envelopes, a deck of cards, a row of bottles in their brown uniforms. They stood like a platoon at ease. The man at the counter took their scrip, play money that nevertheless bought real things, and handed back change that felt like responsibility. The teacher bought paper and a pencil and, that night, wrote a letter to a home he was not sure still existed in the form he remembered. He wrote about weather. He wrote about the food without writing the name of it. He wrote that he was alive and that the enemy had a human face, which he crossed out and replaced with, "We are well." The older man with the clipped hair bought a small tin of tobacco and a comb. He stood in the mirror above the wash basin and made his hair obey. For a full minute, he looked like a man on his way to a job that did not include barbed wire. He allowed himself the cruelty of that minute, and then set it aside as a luxury he could not afford every day. The sergeant bought nothing. He held the scrip, folded it twice, and tucked it into the pocket where he had hidden the bottle cap. He wanted to see if money, even pretend money, would age, whether it would grow warm with the heat of his body and become something like his. Spring announced itself at the edges of things, a runnel of water under the fence, a bird perched on the coil of wire as if it were a branch, grass experimenting with the idea of being green again. Rumors traveled faster than thaw. Work crews would go out to farms. Farmers needed hands. The ground would accept any apology if it was offered as labor. On the first farm crew, the young private rode in the back of a truck with boards for sides, the road unrolling under them like a strip of worn cloth. Fields lay wide and patient, snow frayed thin over their backs. The farmhouse came into view, white paint weathered, a porch that believed in sitting. A woman stood on the steps, apron tied, hands on her hips, and watched them climb down. Her face did not belong to a side. It belonged to the day's work. They planted. They mended fence. They stacked last year's wood and broke down last year's crates. At noon, the farmer's wife brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a jug that invited thirst. She set a row of bottles down on the tailgate of the truck. "Boys," she said, as if she'd known them before. The private took one and held it for a moment, the sun making the brown glass glow like honey. He thought, absurdly and truly, that he could taste the light. Days on the farm bled into one another, each one a small surrender that did not feel like defeat. The farmer said little and said it well. He nodded when a job was done, and nodded differently when it was done right. He had the gift of silence that is not empty. He did not ask where the young men had come from or what they had seen. He cared about fence lines and weather. He cared about hands that closed around shovels with purpose. He cared about the way a row of seedlings could keep its own counsel in straight lines. Back at camp, the kitchen found its own counsel. The heavy-set cook taught the private how to flip a patty without piercing it, how to press a bun to the grill for a second to give it the gentlest kiss of heat. "Don't manhandle it," he said. "You want the juice in, not on your boots." The private learned to hear when onions were done by the way the sizzle changed pitch. He learned that mustard is not the same as ketchup, and that Americans will argue about this with enthusiasm. He learned that some men put both, and some men pick a side as if condiments were flags. He learned that, in this place, sweetness came in bottles and sometimes in faces. One evening, as twilight stretched itself thin and careful over the camp, the interpreter passed by the barracks and found the sergeant sitting on the step, hands unoccupied. He sat down beside him without asking. For a while, they watched the light untie the knots of day. "You speak cleanly," the sergeant said after a time. In Japanese, "I practice on men who cannot correct me," the interpreter said, and for the first time a smile that reached his eyes appeared. "It makes me feel smart." The sergeant nodded toward the wire. "Do you ever forget it's there?" "Only when I'm foolish," the interpreter said. "And sometimes when the wind is right." They sat until the cold asked them to go inside. As they stood, the interpreter reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He pressed it into the sergeant's hand without ceremony. It was a bottle cap. This one flattened into a crude circle by the heel of someone's hand, a hole punched near the edge. "For a charm," he said. "Or for nothing." The sergeant turned it over. It was ugly and shiny and perfect. He nodded. The kind of nod that meant thank you in a language that did not need words. He tucked it into the A-hooked opener, hissed against the cap. The bottle gave a soft pop, a sigh, and a white ghost of breath rose from its mouth. Bubbles spiraled up like tiny lanterns floating in a dark river. The guard with the red cap caught a prisoner's eye and lifted his own bottle in demonstration. "Drink slow," he said, pantomiming a cautious sip. "Don't!" He waggled his hand, then laughed. "Don't shake." The first prisoner did not understand the words, but he understood the warning. He brought the bottle to his lips. The glass was cold enough to sting. The liquid was colder. Sweetness struck first, big and clean. Then a bright fizz raced up his tongue, into his nose, into places where air didn't belong. He coughed, eyes watering. Beside him, another man yelped at the same surprise, slapping a hand to his chest, then laughing. Actually laughing, a sound none of them had made in months without forcing it. "Coca-Cola," the cook said, tapping the label with one sausage-like finger, as if the name itself were a flavor you could point to. "Coca-Cola." He broke it into pieces for them, then put it together again like a trick of cards. Some of the men repeated it softly, "Coca-Cola," testing the corners of the word with their tongues. They moved along the counter. A ladle of beans, glossy with something they could not name. A scoop of potatoes mashed into a cloud. A wedge of apple pie, the crust blistered and golden, cinnamon lingering in the air like a memory. Each tray grew heavier, and so did the strangeness pressing in on them. Food is power. Food is message. What message was this? At a table by the frosted window, 3 men sat in a row, their shoulders almost touching. Kamita, whose hands had calluses from rope work. Saito, bookish, with a small scar at his hairline. And Shinji, a fisherman's son who had always eaten with chopsticks, who looked at the burger like a puzzle with too few pieces. Kamita lifted the top of the bun and narrowed his eyes at the red line. He touched the smear with a fingertip and tasted it. His eyes widened. "Sweet," he said, then frowned. "Also, sharp." "Mustard," Saito murmured, as if he knew the language of colors. He pressed a pickle petal to his tongue and blinked. Vinegar. He had read a pamphlet once, in a port city far from home. American diets, American habits. It had seemed like a fable then. Now, it was his tray. Shinji picked up the whole thing with both hands, feeling the bun give, feeling the heat against his palms. He hesitated, then took a bite. The bun compressed, the meat yielded, juice ran onto his wrist. Salt, fat, onion, and the looming brightness of that red stripe. The flavors collided, then arranged themselves. He had eaten meat before, yes, but not like this. Packed and pressed and seared to a crust. Not with a sweetness that made the salt stand straighter. Not with a sourness that cut through and made his mouth feel bigger. He closed his eyes. A wave passed through him that was not quite pleasure, not quite grief. Something in between. It was the shock of being alive in a place that was supposed to be the end of the story. At the counter, a tall guard in a khaki jacket cleared his throat and pointed to a box of thin paper napkins. He mimed wiping his mouth, then nodded. When Kameta copied him, the guard's mouth tugged into a small, involuntary smile. He had a narrow face and pale eyelashes. His name tag read, Miller. He didn't speak the prisoner's language, and they didn't speak his, but he understood spills and manners and the strange intimacy of feeding those you had been told to hate. "Eat," the cook called from behind the line, shaking a pan to keep the onions from sticking. "Eat while it's hot," they ate. They ate the way men eat when they don't trust the next hour. Quickly, hunched, with a kind of reverence cloaked in hunger. The room filled with small domestic sounds, bottles clinking, metal utensils tapping, a radio in the corner whispering a tune in a warm baritone, the voice sliding up and down like a hand along a banister. They didn't know the words, but the shape of the song suggested a road without end. Saito took a careful sip of the cola and thought of a festival when he was a boy. Paper lanterns, sugared plums, his mother's hand on his shoulder, the momentary sense that the world was made of permission. Sweetness was not a flavor. It was a condition. Kameta ate by deconstructing. Bun lifted, meat examined, pickle repositioned, as if he could improve this foreign architecture by geometry. He tried the mustard alone, coughed, then grinned with wet eyes. He placed a coin of pickle atop the yellow smear and decided the two needed each other. He nodded, satisfied with his own small treaty. Shinji held the burger and thought of his father's boat, the blunt bow that battered through chop in the pre-dawn dark, the smell of diesel and kelp. He could not picture this haul in the same world as that black water. He took another bite anyway. After months of salt pork strings and thin stews and a stomach that made itself small, he felt his body remember how to become a house again. When the first hunger receded, the men began to look up. They watched the Americans without watching, the way one watches a fire, learning its rules. The cooks moved without wasted movement. The guards stood at their stations but leaned, shifted, told jokes to each other in low tones. Their laughter sounded like things falling harmlessly. Now and then, a guard refilled his own mug with coffee, and the steam climbed like a flag. The scent of coffee, bitter, dark, a little like burnt bread, made Saito's mouth water, despite himself. At the end of the table, a young prisoner named Mori pinched the flaky lid off his pie and hid it under his tray, saving it for later. The guard with the red cap saw, cocked his head, and said something that could have meant, "Go on." When Mori didn't move, the guard tapped the pie plate and held up 2 fingers, then pointed to the counter. A second wedge arrived a minute later. Smaller, yes, but undeniable. Maury bowed without standing. He did not have words big enough for that little mercy. The sergeant who had kept them together on the platform ate more slowly than the rest. He was counting, as men with responsibilities always count. Not numbers, but risks. He watched for a trap that did not spring. He let the sweetness dissolve on his tongue, held it there until it thinned into something he could swallow, and still feel he was himself. When he set the bottle down, he whispered a prayer that neither accused nor praised, only named what was. Cold light leaned in from the windows. Outside, snow feathered across the parade ground, smoothing out the boot prints until the path from train to hall was just another pale seam in a white field. Inside, heat pressed against faces, made their ears glow pink, turned their palms slick. The radio faltered, caught, then brought them a scrap of a brassy tune. Something about home. Home is a word you could pretend was a place, and not a person. Down the line, there were small experiments. 2 men traded pickles for extra onions. Someone tried the beans with mustard and declared, through gestures and laughter, that this was not a good idea. A guard mimed how to hold the burger with one hand and the bottle with the other. A comic pantomime that drew a couple of quiet chuckles. The guard performing a kind of glove puppet theater with bread and glass. In another era, another place, it would have been slapstick. Here, the joke was that there could be a joke at all. In the corner, a bulletin board held a notice with the words Geneva Convention in large black letters. The prisoners could not read it, but they could feel its shape in what was happening. Metal trays, food that did not insult, a bottle per man. Kameda pointed at the board and raised his eyebrows at Saito. Saito shrugged. A law can be printed. A law can also be cooked, poured, left on a table. Shinji took his last bite slowly. He set the bun's heel down like a finished thought and licked his wrist, where juice had dried to a salty shine. The guard, Miller, appeared at his elbow with a small stack of napkins, offered them like a deck of cards. Shinji nodded. He had nodded 100 times to fishermen, to buyers, to foremen. This nod was different. It carried no bargain, no calculation. It was both smaller and heavier. When the trays were mostly empty and the bottles stood like little brown chimneys, the cook rang a bell with the back of a spoon. 5 minutes, he called. He made his hand flat, tipped it side to side, 5, 5, then pointed to the door. Even without the words, they understood. There is order to this mercy. They cleared their places. They lined up to give back the trays, to drop spoons and forks into a bucket where water steamed and clinked. A prisoner near the end of the line hesitated over his bottle, reluctant to hand back the last proof of an afternoon that felt like a dream you could hold. The guard with the red cap tapped the bottle's belly and pointed to a bin. Then he reached behind the counter, hesitated, and brought out a cap. Just the cap, bright with red paint. He placed it in the prisoner's hand, smiling with one corner of his mouth as if to say, "A souvenir of bubbles." Back in the cold, on the way to the barracks, the men exhaled together, and the breath rose like smoke from an invisible factory. Their faces had color now. Their steps found a cadence. Words returned in small clumps. "Did you taste?" "What was the—" "I think the red." But the sound that rolled from them most often was the smallest word in any language. Surprise softened into belief. In the barracks, bunks waited with their coarse blankets. The air held the scent of wet wool and old wood. Someone found a scrap of pencil and wrote in a pocket notebook, "Bread round, meat thick, sweet water that bites." He added times and temperatures, as if this could be a report to an officer who might still care. He drew the bottle's shape from memory, a curve that made no sense and perfect sense at once. The sergeant lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He could feel the meal settling into muscles that had forgotten how to unclench. He was not foolish. He did not think this was kindness without calculation. But he also knew that calculation had not stolen the flavor from the meat, had not dulled the soda's spark. A man could be fed by policy and still be fed. Night folded itself around the camp. A train horn stitched the distance. The wind pawed at the barracks like a clumsy animal. Somewhere, an American laughed, high and brief, then coughed. Somewhere else, a prisoner whispered his mother's name into his blanket, not because he was a child, but because he had been allowed a moment to remember he was someone's child still. Later, sleep spread through the bunks like a tide taking back a beach. In that hush, dreams took on the shape of what the day had taught them. Not victory, not defeat, but the electric truth that the world could be both more terrible and more generous than any story. Years afterward, when they tried to tell it, to wives who poured tea with quiet hands, to children who grew tall in a peace they did not earn, the words would wobble. They would say, "We were captured. We were afraid." And then there was something called a burger. There was a drink that stung and sang at the same time. They would laugh at themselves, shake their heads. How could a life hold war and pie on the same page? And yet, that is what the day had done. Laid down two truths side by side until the seam between them felt less like a wound and more like a stitch.